Hi everyone, it's been a while and I'm sorry for the lack of videos. As I think I've implied in a lot of posts, my health has not been great, and it's just gotten in the way of filming videos. I've been on the calls every morning and talked to a few of you, and I will continue to make all the call sessions, but I am going to try to catch us up a little bit on some of the topics that we are a little behind on, and I hope all of you are staying well and taking care of those who are important to you. So, today I want to talk about Lawrence versus Texas and the case Bowers versus Hardwick that comes before it. One thing that I think contextualizes these cases as very important right now is if you look at Supreme Court cases decided just these past few weeks, and if you look at what's on the horizon for the Supreme Court, the jurisprudential question of when do we overturn decisions that we know are wrong or decisions that we think are wrong is one that is going to be a big deal in thinking about the abortion precedents that we've already talked about. So what do the cases hold? Broadly speaking, Bowers versus Hardwick. Oh, there's a cat falling. Bowers versus Hardwick is a case from 1986 that holds that, quote, there is not a fundamental right to engage in homosexual sodomy. At issue in the case is the constitutionality of a Georgia law that criminalizes sodomy between adults, both homosexual and heterosexual. Right, the law doesn't differentiate, and nonetheless, the way that the Supreme Court approaches it in Bowers versus Hardwick is basically, look, you don't have a constitutional right that protects you from the state making this kind of behavior illegal. And therefore, while we think that this law is stupid, we don't think that, and one of the judges says that, we don't think that this is a constitutional problem. This problem doesn't have a constitutional dimension. If that reminds you of some of the arguments against the Roe versus Wade decision, it should. Now, Lawrence versus Texas, 2003, the Supreme Court revisits Bowers. And so, that's not a whole lot of years. That's a little quick math in my head. I think it's 17 years later. And in a 6-3 decision written by Anthony Kennedy, the Supreme Court turns around and says, well, hold on. I think that Bowers versus Hardwick conceived of the question incorrectly. And instead, rather than thinking of it, do you have a constitutional right to homosexual sodomy? Instead, the question at issue is, do you have a right to intimate and profoundly important conduct between consenting adults? And ultimately, the Supreme Court there said that, we think that there is this privacy right. We can read it in the cases we've decided before, and whatever that right encompasses, it must encompass this thing or it must forbid passing laws that target people in this particular way. Obviously, in the time since Lawrence versus Texas, there has been a lot interpreting it, and there's been a lot of thinking about what does this mean. So one of the things that is unclear, even with Obergefell, which we'll get to in a bit, which is the gay marriage decision, is how far does the right discussed in Lawrence versus Texas go? What I want to talk about in this video, though, is what might it have been that flipped the court's decision in Lawrence versus Texas? So first of all, I think one thing that the court has very much in mind in this case is how does this law get enforced? And I think that's important because the place that jurisprudentially the right at issue comes from is a place where it's framed as a privacy right, like the right to abortion. Right, these are both framed initially as privacy rights, drawing largely on cases concerning things, or on one particular case, Griswold versus Connecticut, that holds that a right to privacy is implicit in the due process clause of the Constitution. Now, what does a ban on sodomy, whether homosexual or heterosexual, have to do with privacy? Well, the police have to enforce it. And so in the case Lawrence versus Texas, what you had is police coming into a person's apartment very late at night and reporting seeing people engaged in this illegal sex, right? And so there was even a challenge in the first place to why did the police enter this apartment in the first place? Why did the police enter the apartment? We don't think they had the right to enter. And I think you can certainly read into the decision a lot of concern with, well, if these laws are on the books and police are allowed to investigate this, no matter what they're doing, any investigation of this kind of crime is going to constitute an intrusion into this very intimate space. So the early right to privacy cases that evolve into the decisions on abortion concern a doctor giving a married couple advice on using or not using contraceptives, and there's a ban that says, okay, well, doctors, you can't give people advice on contraceptives because we think that the only contraception that you should be using is not having sex. And in terms of how that plays out in Lawrence, I think there's an instinct that this is not the realm for the law, right? Kind of the flip side to a refrain we hear very often in other contexts is if what you think about, and one of the judges who later changed his mind about his decision in Bowers said, we think that this is really about morality, and there's nothing wrong with this because this has been something held to be immoral by our society forever. So if we're talking about the right in Bowers, if we're talking about morality, well, it turns out that there's a lot of precedent for the idea that we should be legislating conduct, but we shouldn't be legislating morality. And I think that distinction, it's hard to draw, but ultimately the point becomes, well, if what we're talking about is morality, and if we are concerned with making sure people are moral, that's not the role of the legislature, that's not the role of the courts, and that's not the role of the government. One way that people have interpreted Lawrence and interpreted kind of this line of privacy cases is thinking of them as enacting almost a John Stuart Millian harm principle. That is, Mill proposes that we can think of the world as, or we can think of this principle that when should the government act? Well, it should act when people are harming others, and when there is no harm to anyone, right? No external harm in an action, then that's not the government's business. In some ways, you can read that as an interpretation of Lawrence that is valid. And I'm going to pause for a second because I'm going to need to deal with my nose, and I'll come back in the next video.